God's gone on here this week. And there's a lot that's gone on in Denver, and a lot's going on all over the place, Father. We're distracted by many things in our family and our work and our community, Father, our country. Grab our hearts, Father, and our minds from wherever they are. And focus them in on your word this morning. May your Spirit teach us all, Father. And make us different because we're here with you. I pray this in Jesus' name. Amen. Keith mentioned I am a missionary, and so this coming month, I'll have been a missionary for 25 years. I was first appointed with the Conservative Baptist Home Mission Society 25 years ago. As their missionary to New Age people, started going to the psychic fairs, hooked up with Mark, and we were kind of doing this all alone. And several years ago, it just got bigger and bigger. We were talking to Muslims and Buddhists and Mormons, oh my. We were talking to everybody. And so Haven kind of came out of all that we broadened the mission just beyond the New Age to all sorts of different people, cults that most people have never even heard of, and be glad because they're so nasty and destructive. Anyways, as we look at the classic mission passage, I have a question to ask you all today. Is Jesus a liar? All right? And that's the question for this day. It's been no surprise as a missionary, of course, that people who are not believers would reject the Christian message. Of course they will. Evangelism has never been popular in terms of how the world views it. It certainly wasn't when I was first presented. The first several people that tried to share the gospel with me got cussed at and screamed at. It was the right thing to do. Who are these sickos? What's wrong with them? And I think about this is that it's nothing new at all. The message certainly wasn't enjoyed. Well, the disciples didn't like it half the time they heard it. And certainly the people around them didn't like it. It's the normal thing to do. I want you to hear what an ancient Roman thought of the Christian message. Because he saw something in it that I don't even know if all Christians really understand. I think he saw it right. This is from a book by a guy named David Bentley Hart. He's an Orthodox priest. And his book is called Atheist Delusions. And he hits on something very important here. He's talking about the ancient Roman world and how they received the message. In particular, one guy named Celsus, a very famous patrician and elite leader in the Roman culture. In such a world, the polytheism and syncretism of ancient Rome, the gospel was an outrage. And it was perfectly reasonable for its cultured despisers to describe its apostles as atheists. That was one of the early names for the church. Christians were, what could be more obvious, enemies of society, impious, subversive, and irrational. And it was no more than civic prudence to detest them for refusing to honor the gods of their ancestors, for scorning the common good, for advancing the grotesque and shameful claim that all the gods and spirits had been made subject to a crucified criminal from Galilee. One who during his life had consorted with peasants and harlots, lepers, and lunatics. This was far worse than mere irreverence. It was pure and misanthropic and perversity. It was anarchy. One can see something in this alarm in the fragments we still possess on true doctrine by the 2nd century pagan Celsus. It is unlikely that Celsus would have thought the Christians worth his notice as he had not recognized something uniquely dangerous lurking in their gospel-loving beings. Understand, at this time, there are 1,000 religions under the Roman roof. They conquered pagan groups from all over the world. They didn't care about what you believed. If you want serious religion, go talk to the Jews.
Right.
They really did not care about what you believed. So it's so ironic that this one group is going to catch their attention and for close to 300 years catch their abuse to the tune of hundreds of thousands of Christians being killed for the first 300 years of the church. Listen to why they thought this way. He would have naturally viewed the new religion with a certain patrician disdain, undoubtedly, and his treatise contains considerable quantity of contempt for the ridiculous rabble and pliable simpletons that Christianity attracted into its fold, the low-born, the uneducated, slaves, women and children, cobblers, laundresses, weavers of wool, and so forth. And at that level, Christianity would have been no more than distasteful to St. Celsus, any more than the other Asiatic superstitions that occasionally coursed through the empire, working mischief in every social class, provoking a largely impotent consternation from the educated and well-bred. It would have hardly merited the energetic attack that he actually wrote. What clearly, genuinely horrified Celsus about this particular superstition was not its predictable vulgarity, but the novel spirit of rebellion that permeated its teachings. He continually speaks of Christianity as a form of sedition, or rebellion. And what he principally condemns is defiance of the immemorial religious customs of the world's tribes, cities, and nations. The several peoples of the earth, he believed, were governed by various gods who acted as lieutenants of the great God. And the laws and customs they had established in every place were part of the divine constitution of the universe. Lots of gods, of course. Which no one, highborn or low, should presume to disregard or abandon. It was appalling to him that Christians, feeling no decent reverence for these ancient ordinances and institutions, should refrain from worship of the gods, should decline to venerate the good demons who served as intermediaries between the humans and the divine world, and should even refuse to pray to the ancient powers for the emperor. These Christians were so depraved so as to think themselves entirely above the temples and traditions and cults of their ancestors. They ludicrously enough imagined themselves somehow to have been raised above the deathless emissaries of God, the divine stars, and all the other celestial agencies, and to have been granted a kind of immediate intimacy with God himself. And thus claiming emancipation from the principalities and powers, the thrones and dominions, they'd also renounced their spiritual and moral ties to their peoples and to the greater cosmic order. To Celsus, this was all too clearly an unnatural and deracinated piety, a religion which, like no other, rather than providing a sacred bond between the believer and his nation, sought to transcend nations altogether. And of course he was entirely correct. The Christians indeed were a separate notion, people, or at least aspired to be, another nation within each nation, a new humanity that, according to Justin Martyr, learned no longer to despise those of other races, but rather to live with them as brothers and sisters. You have to see how unique that is. They conquered all these races, they had all these slaves, and they hated each other. The Greeks didn't love Persians because they were both conquered by the Romans. The Egyptians didn't love the Syrians because they were both conquered by the Romans. They all hated each other. The Christians were doing something unique and something they'd never seen before. And it scared Celsus. And as we see, it should have. Well, anyways, you get the idea. Celsus's complaint is so interesting in the sense that he points out what was such a great offense was not that people saw Jesus as resurrected, not that Jesus was one of many religious options. It was the idea that Jesus was the only way.
Right.
It was the idea that Jesus alone could make you right with God, and you needed nothing else. And that terrified him because he saw what that really meant. And to the ancient Christian church was put under the sword with the question, is Caesar Lord or is Jesus Lord? It was really simple. You can see that in Celsus' complaint. Who is going to be Lord? And to the early Christians, it was Jesus. Like I said, I'm not sure all Christians today take this that seriously. Why do I say this? Because this is nothing new, and it's not alone. In fact, it's very normal for this to happen. You can see this what happened with, Jesus and the disciples themselves. You can see what the Huns are going to do, what the Goths did, what the Visigoths did, what Hindus and Buddhists did when the Christians went there. I mean, after all, Jesus was killed. Stephen was killed. Paul and Peter were killed, and so on, and so on. The Hus followers, Wycliffe, the Waldenses, the Huguenots, Puritans. So when we see Boko Haram, and we see Al-Shabaab, and ISIL, whatever you want to call them, North Korea and China doing these things today, why are we surprised? Because didn't Jesus tell us every bit of this was coming? Didn't he lay that out very clearly? It's horrific. It's horrifying to see this stuff. The stuff that they advertise with to each other. The stuff that ISIS puts on the internet so that other Muslims around the world will see how authentic they are. It's horrifying beyond belief. And yet, we look at this and we go, how could this possibly be? Well, it's always been on the table for the followers of Jesus. And he said that quite plainly. He told us every bit of this was coming. Well, that's one thing. It's easy enough to get to understand why non-Christians don't like hearing the gospel. I understand. What I really have had a struggle with since the time I've been a missionary, and some of this was already happening before I was a missionary, is the fact that the church would fall out of love with mission. That the church itself would start talking, in some respects, almost exactly like the people that are outside of the church. Mission becomes despised. Well, let me give you some examples. I'll give you some big words here. Universalism, pluralism, inclusivism, panentheism. Not to lose anybody here, universalism is the belief that everybody's saved, regardless of what you believe or what you don't believe, regardless of how you act or how you don't act. It doesn't matter. Everybody's cool with God, and God's cool with everybody. And this is what you saw coming out of Love Wins by Rob Bell and all sorts of other people who claim to be Christian. Pluralism, more of a technical term, is the belief that God works through all the various religions equally. That there's nothing unique about following Christ. You can come to God by following Krishna, Muhammad, name the option. It's all on the same table as far as God's concerned. Inclusivism is a little more subtle. We see this in all sorts of so-called evangelical circles. Inclusivism is the idea that Jesus saves everybody, whether they want it or not. This came out of Vatican II in a strong way about 50 years ago, with a guy named Hans Kung and Karl Rahner. They talked about anonymous Christians, quote unquote, which is the teaching, if you were raised old school Catholic, you know how different this was for you. The teaching that everybody's really a Catholic, therefore they're all part of the Mother Church, therefore they're all going to be fine in heaven someday. Why? It doesn't matter what you actually believe. And the current Pope's been making statements like this for years, as did the Popes right before him. That you can be a Muslim, a firewalker, an atheist, a Satanist, it doesn't matter. Everybody's really a Catholic, therefore we're all saved. Now this is also reflected sometimes by people like Rick Warren, and other people just like this, talking about the fact that everybody's saved by Jesus regardless of whether you believe in him. Now think about that for a second if you're a missionary. What a waste of time. Why would you bother if everybody's going to be saved? It doesn't make any sense. The newest one that came out with the emergent church is this panentheism. It's actually not a new term. It's actually what every Hindu, what most Buddhists, what every pagan of every religion I can think of in the ancient world always believed. And if you watch Pocahontas, you've got this, or Avatar. All right, it's the fact that the divine force of the universe is in nature. And therefore, when you worship nature, you're worshiping the gods. The God. Doesn't matter. God's in everything. And God's in us. So when you listen to Rob Bell, Tony Jones, Brian McLaren, all these guys who call themselves Christians, talk about how the divine is within all of us, then you're listening to ancient paganism. No Hindu could have said, no follower of Baal, or any of the Baals, could have said it any better than that. That the divine is in all of nature. Therefore, when I worship the cat, the rat, the dog, the stars, everything, I'm appropriately worshiping what I should worship. Again, I expect pagans to talk that way. They always have. What is terrifying and so heartbreaking in a lot of ways is to watch apostasy right in front of my face, to watch people call themselves Christians, coming out of all sorts of Christian schools in major pulpits in the country. Now they're talking about how mission's been a waste of time. Therefore, the question I ask for you again, is Jesus a liar? So again, look at Matthew 28 as we go through this whole thing. I just have a couple more examples. It's so interesting. Tony Campolo, who's 35 years ago I really liked, it's gone so far away from what he used to say in some ways, but he calls himself the leader of this group called the Red Letter Christians. We take the words of Jesus seriously. Actually, they don't. If you actually look at all the words of Jesus, they don't take it serious at all. But Tony's come out over the years and embraced homosexuality and all sorts of other things. And Tony just 2 weeks ago endorsed Hillary Clinton. The same weekend she gave a message. Again, this is not a political speech. I just want you to think about the import. The same weekend Hillary gave a message, a talk at a particular foundation where she talked about the fact that religious people, and what she meant by that was that people in opposition to abortion and homosexuality and same-sex marriage, religious people are going to have their beliefs changed. Now, when politicians of that level start talking this way, you have to start getting interested.
That's right.
How are we going to exactly do that? It's the process by which we change people's beliefs. And Tony just endorsed her that very week as a good Christian and a person who wants to follow. Two other examples. I had Brian McLaren's book a couple of years ago, spent an entire chapter explaining why everything that Jesus says in John 14:6, that I am the way and the truth and the life, no one comes to the Father but by me, kind of the classic passage of how necessary Jesus is to salvation. He didn't really mean that. He spent an entire chapter trying to weasel away from what Jesus said. And there's a new one out, kind of the same version. There's a guy going around the country named Matt Vine, who's going out and trying to debate Christians on how all the passages in the Bible talk about homosexuality. Well, they didn't mean it either. So we're talking about people who call themselves Christians that are going after the Word of God fairly directly. It doesn't mean what it seems to mean, what the church has historically thought it meant. And that includes many passages about salvation and other issues like that. So, let's look at what Jesus actually says to these folks. Because he says some really hard things. And the question we have for you is, what will you do with that? Look at verse 17. When they saw him, they worshipped him, but some were doubtful. And this is a fun place for me. I, of course, was raised a complete non-believer. It wasn't a matter of doubt. This is all stupid. You have to be a moron to take this kind of stuff seriously. And here I am, as that moron. Well, think about the people Jesus has said this to. They've been following him around for 3 years. Think of what they have heard. And not only what they've heard, think about what they have seen. Think about the amazing things these guys have seen. You see, I don't think faith has ever been produced by a miracle. It never has been. Despite what you saw on alleged Christian TV at night with Oral Roberts and a billion others, faith has never produced by miracles. Think of some biblical examples. Look at Pharaoh and Moses. What did Pharaoh say? Did it inspire him with faith? No. And half the Jews forgot 2 weeks later they're asking for veggies. What is the problem? Right? They don't remember very well either. Think of some other examples. One of my favorite examples in the Bible is Jesus goes into an obscure town. He heals a guy's withered hand. Think about the people in that synagogue who have been raised with this guy as their friend, their neighbor, whatever. They'd seen this guy, they'd known him with that hand forever, and they see it change right in front of them. This isn't some story told by somebody else that lived hundreds of years before. They saw it happen right in front of them. And one of them's first reaction is to go rat him out because he did it on the wrong day. What did you not see? How could you look at what you just saw? And your first reaction is to tell on Jesus? Really? How does that make any sense at all? Now put your guys in these shoes here in verse 17. When they saw him, they worshipped, but some were doubtful. It's interesting that the emerging church in the last 15 raised doubt, to quote John MacArthur, to a cardinal virtue. In other words, one of the most important things about your Christian faith is to not believe. That's an interesting thing. I don't remember reading that part, but that's what these guys have been saying for several years now. So how rational is it to see the things that they've seen that are already discussed, and now the big one? Yeah. The resurrection of Jesus himself, which he had told them several times was going to happen. They hear it, they don't believe it, he tells them over and over again, then it actually happens right in front of them, and they still don't believe? How is that even possible? How irrational is to see these things happen in front of your face and not respond well to that? It makes no sense at all. But it really does reveal faith. It does not produce it. It reveals what's already going on in your heart. And let me give you some great examples of that from the other side, from the dark side, as it were. Very famous atheist Bertrand Russell, taught at Cambridge, wrote a book, 50 Reasons, well, a lot of books, but he wrote 50 Reasons Why I'm Not a Christian. And he attacked the Christian faith with all his heart. And I read that as a brand new Christian, and then I read it about 10 years ago, and I was surprised what a lame book it was. After I'd gone through grad school, I was like, this is terrible. This is written for freshmen. But anyways, Bertrand Russell was famously asked if he was wrong, and he was in front of God, and he had an answer for why he didn't believe. What would he say when God says, why don't you believe? And Bertrand Russell says, I needed just a little more evidence, just a little more evidence. To which I cried, that's a total lie. You're lying through your teeth. Why did Bertrand Russell not believe? And this is true with a lot of these fellows. If you read a book called Intellectuals, you get a picture of Bertrand Russell and a whole lot of other people like this. And Bertrand Russell chased every skirt on the planet at Cambridge. He was such a womanizer. He could not stop. And he didn't want anything to stop him. He was so bad that the United States actually deemed him as such a subversive character they wouldn't let him come into the United States to speak at a conference. Because he was, before the hippies ever got going, Bertrand Russell was a total freak with ladies. I'm sorry to be offensive here at all, but this is who this guy really was. And he's not the only one. You see guy after guy, especially some of these men, some of the most famous atheists, with this real problem with not just God's existence, but with God's rules. And how God calls you to live. So let me give you a fun example. About 10 years ago, Ravi Zacharias, a very good Christian thinker and writer, found a quote by Aldous Huxley. Some of you might have had to read, if you're old like me, you had to read Brave New World when you were in high school. Aldous Huxley was the inspiration for a whole lot of the New Age movement, inspiration for the band, the Doors, had a real influence on the hippies and stuff like this. And Aldous Huxley makes this interesting quote. By the way, he's the grandson of Darwin's best friend, Thomas Huxley. He was often nicknamed Darwin's bulldog because he would go out, really push evolution in the university before they were really totally like they are now. And here's what Huxley said, which was fascinating. He says, Darwin had to be right so we could do what we want to do. I have to thank you for your brief moment of honesty there. It has nothing to do with facts. This has to do with the necessity of being able to do what you want to do. So I was checking this quote out when I was getting this sermon ready a few weeks ago, just to make sure I had it right. And I ran into Huxley's brother, Sir Julian Huxley. Also a very famous Darwinian, very famous pusher, was the head of the National Science Foundation, whatever, in England, all these different organizations like that. And Huxley talked about this interesting thing. Huxley said that at the end of his life, he'd come to doubt a lot of the stuff that Darwin had taught because he knew the reason he believed it was so that he could do what he wanted to do. It was almost a mirror statement to what his brother had said. Now, isn't that fascinating? Did the facts change? No. But what I needed was on the table. I can't believe in this God. He doesn't let me do what I want to do. And I think that's a whole lot of that. I think when you see what the disciples saw, and not just them, but Pharaoh, all the way up to the Pharisees and others who saw this thing, what was revealed is their heart. It wasn't anything else but that. So let's move on from that. Jesus comes up to them and says, all authority has been given to me in heaven and on earth. Maybe you should look at that again. All authority has been given to me. As much as you might think one way or the other of the current administration, it's not his. It never has been his. It's not the Supreme Court's hands that decides it, because the authority is in God's hands, in particular in Jesus. And it has been for a long time. And it's hard for us as Christians to see this, especially if you see the change in the culture. It's so dramatic, and I'm old enough to watch this happen, and guess what? It's not in their hands. Yeah. It's always been in the Lord's hands. And our refusal to see that causes us much, much misunderstanding and problem. Well, what are we to do with that authority? Go out and conquer people? No, it doesn't say that. All authority has been given to me in heaven and on earth. Go therefore. So in light of this, and make disciples of all the nations. I want you to think how hard these words are. If you've grown up in a Christian church, which I think probably most of you have, you've heard this forever, it seems normal. Put yourself in Jewish shoes for just a minute. Everybody out there hates you, and you hate them. It's real simple, starting right there, okay? It doesn't have to get much more complex than that. Those are the Goyim, the nations. Right? I grew up most of my life as a non-Jewish person in a Jewish neighborhood. I was the dumb Goy in the neighborhood. I didn't know what any of this meant. I didn't know anything about any religion. Sex, drugs, and rock and roll seemed to be religion everywhere I know. My whole school basically was called Hebrew High in Los Angeles. Nobody believed anything that I could tell, right, that made any difference in anybody's life. But I did know this. When I got saved, my best friend, I had gone to Dallas for my senior, my best friend literally threw me out of the house. I thought I was so foolish. I got saved as a senior in high school when I was away from my friends in LA. I honestly thought he would be excited that I worshiped the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. I had no idea what I'd run into. He grabbed my arm and he walked me out of his house. My best friend. And I know now, he'd been raised his entire life to think of how the Christians hated him, killed his people throughout all of European history, were responsible for the Holocaust, good Christian Hitler was, and so on and so on. That's what he had been taught. He didn't believe anything religious. He did know that Christians hated his people. And so now his friend had become one of them, and he walks me out the door. Well, I get it now. I understand what was going on there. And it's so interesting. Last summer, several of us from Haven were in New York, partnering with Chosen People Ministries to share the gospel with Russian Jews and other people throughout the city of New York. A marvelous opportunity to talk to Jewish people all over the place. Great responses. And for whatever reason, we had all this Jewish literature based on Isaiah 53. Kept having Muslims come up to the table. And for whatever reason, they're always coming to me. So I had this great, everybody's talking to Jews, and I'm talking to Muslims half the time. It's kind of strange. But in this whole thing, he's telling these guys to leave their comfort zone and to go out amongst the people who hate their guts. And don't forget, they hated their guts too. It went both ways. It was an equal opportunity hatred. And you see this play out in the book of Acts with Peter and others. Make disciples. Now we all understand what disciples means. It's not a different thing to be a follower. Walk in the footsteps, whatever analogy you want to use. So what do we do with this verse if you're a red-letter Christian? If you're a guy who thinks that Jesus is now... What is the point of Jesus? He's certainly not a judge. In fact, Brian McClare famously said several years ago that this is a guy considered one of the top Christians in the country by Time magazine and others. He said, if you believe Jesus is coming back as a judge, you believe in, quote, jihadi Jesus. Quote unquote. That's Jesus has been Laden, apparently, for believing what the Bible actually says about Jesus. Well, what is Jesus? Well, he's accepted. He's fine with everything and everyone. There's a half-truth in this. There really is. Well, is Jesus willing to accept people wherever they are? Of course he is. Does he love them enough to change them? Of course he does. Well, that part's what's been changed. There's no need for repentance. There's no need to change anything. You don't even need to believe. As we already saw, everybody's going to be saved anyway. So what is Jesus? Well, Jesus is the guy who's down with the poor, fine with gay marriage, great with redistribution of wealth, so on and so on. Jesus is Karl Marx. Interesting transposition there. Well, there we sit. So we have people making disciples. I just wonder what they're making disciples to. You'll see how this plays out later on. Then he says to baptize them We know baptism is a symbol. The symbol is not interchangeable. You see a lot of things, the symbol of a symbol, and if you get into the postmodern and post-critical discourse in the university, it's so boring. The signifier, the signified, it just goes on and on and on. It's all this different jargon. And basically all it means is it's all interpretation. You can make anything you want out of it. Well, the early church knew what baptism meant. When you were laid down, you went into the tomb. You were dead. That was the whole point of the symbolism. You're going to die. You're going to take Jesus' cross seriously. You're identifying with that very thing that Jesus did for us. Well, that gets lost in most of the context today. It really has. It doesn't mean death. It simply means identification. At least it means that. It actually meant a lot more. But let me show you how this has changed the mission world and now how it's changed ours. One of the big fights in missionology, long before I came to be a Christian or a missionary, is the whole contextualization argument. Just to make this as simple as I can. Contextualization in missions means, look, if you're going to take the gospel to some tribe up in the mountains of the Philippines, or you're going to take them to the Congos or a zillion other places, does that have to look like American Christianity? Do we need to take pews in an organ and so on? Or do we have to wear a tie? Well, you Baptists, most of you don't even wear ties. Good for you. Does it have to look like American Christianity? And of course, that would be a stupid argument. Of course, it doesn't have to. Those things aren't the heart of the Christian faith. And it can fit in some cultural models all over the place. So that's this interesting discussion, kind of the big thing. And we have categories set up from what's called C1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Now let me show you how controversial this has gotten, especially with this thing called C6. All right? This is the ultimate version of contextualization. So where this became very controversial several years ago is when you're dealing with Muslim cultures. What do you do? Okay? And a C6 Christian looks like this. A Muslim believes in Jesus. At least that's what we're told. He will never be baptized. He will never go to a church. He will never tell anybody, even in his own family, about his conversion. But he will do his prayers every day. He'll stand outside and recite the Shahada, the creed, there is no God but Allah, Muhammad is his prophet. He will do the Ramadan fast and the feasting and all the fun stuff there. He will make sure that he does his Hajj, does his trip to Mecca. He will go to jihad if he is called upon to do that, to fight against those unbelieving Christians or Jews or pagans or whoever. But when he goes to the mosque on Friday, he will secretly pray to Isa, the Arabic word for Jesus. And that's what a Christian looks like in the Muslim world. So this is the most extreme example of contextualization. He will not do anything. And so the response has been, wait a second, how's that even a Christian in any way? How come he's not getting baptized or something like this? Well, his life is at risk. I understand. And it's very easy for me to say in America that he ought to go ahead and do what Jesus says anyways. I understand what I'm saying. Okay? Nonetheless, as we're going to see by the end of this passage, is it a surprise? It can't possibly be a surprise to any of us today that identifying with Jesus may cost you your life. It's a surprise to most Americans. We just don't live with that. It is not a surprise in Nigeria. Almost every Sunday, churches are attacked. Yeah. It's almost hard to get home after church because you know you're going to see the news and there's another church that's been attacked by Boko Haram or something like this. It's not a surprise in Pakistan or in Korea, North Korea, or in China, or so many other places. One of my dear friends was killed, pastor was killed in Malaysia a couple years ago. About 5'8", 140 pounds, tiny little guy, in his 60s. One of the dearest men you'll ever meet. Adopted older children who had HIV and stuff like this. He was a great guy. And he was tortured for hours by 3 young Muslim men, and then finally murdered. 3 years later, still hadn't even gone to trial. Not even, they knew who did it, they just don't care. It's Malaysia. It's a Muslim world. So I understand what this means. I understand for us as Americans, we think things are getting tight. I think they are too. And things may change pretty dramatically for us. And I think when Jesus calls them to make disciples, commanding them to do all things that I have told you, that he understands exactly what he's saying.
Yeah.
And hence he understands, I think, what he's speaking to us today. That we are understanding that the call of Christ is not the soft, cushy life. This is not your best life now. And woe to the person who thinks it is. The call to follow Jesus is to take up your cross. And the Muslim who does that puts his life at risk. We have Mark and I have a dear friend in Boulder, George Hussney, who's a wonderful ministry, Horizon, to Muslims. And he can't stand this C6 nonsense. And he understands the price better than anybody. He's Lebanese, he's Arab. He goes over there, he rescues these people, he tries to get them out of the country, he does a lot of things for them to get them to safety. He knows better than anybody. And he knows you can't follow Christ in such a truncated fashion. But it's not even beginnable to be recognized. When I was a brand new Christian, there was this wonderful bumper sticker. If you were arrested for being a Christian, would there be enough evidence for you to be convicted? It was kind of grabbing then. I think it's even more grabbing to me now. Because the heat is coming. And it is for the normal case throughout the history of the church. It's been the normal case throughout the culture for the last thousands of years. So why should we think we're immune? All right. Let's look at the next thing he says. Baptize in the name of the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Spirit, teaching them to observe all that I've commanded you. Here's my problem. It's bad enough that this has been an attitude amongst missionaries. By the way, when we go to the Philippines, and we'll be there in 6 weeks, Lord willing, one of the places we stay is the Summer Institute of Linguistics, the Wycliffe House there in Manila. It's a great place. We talk to these wonderful people who, they're amazing. They're so strange. They're so smart. And they go off in the middle of nowhere and find a tribe. No language even comes close to being printed. And they'll spend years with them to figure out a language and put the New Testament especially into their hands. And they have no clue what's happening in the rest of the world. So I'm telling all this stuff happening in America, and they're all unhappy. They're telling me about these amazing things they're doing with these tribes I've never begun to have heard of. It's just a fun time with them, and I look forward to seeing them again. Well, the problem is that the C6 thing has not been content to stay in the mission world. It's become our attitude here. And really, it started inside the church growth movement with Bill Hybels and Rick Warren and others. How do we make the church someplace people want to go? Do we tell them, you're going to die for following Christ? That probably won't sell too well. So let's get rid of all these offensive things, like the cross. We need to remove that. We shouldn't ever talk about hell anymore. We shouldn't talk about anything that offends people. Everybody that's coming out of my seminary for years was going out and do their church planning, do your demographics, survey the neighborhood, find out what people wanted, and then make your church look like that. There you go. Complete seeker-sensitive model, right? That's just contextualization on the home front. The emerging church grows up as a niche inside that very mindset. So how are we going to reach the new millennials? We're going to do the same thing. We're going to remove everything that offends them. So for example, Dan Kimball, kind of an emerging church guru, comes out with a book several years ago. They love Jesus, but they hate the church.
Right.
I'm going, you're wrong on your title right off the bat.
Right.
Okay. But his solution has come out from many other Pew reports and Gallup and everybody else. Well, the church is down on homosexuality. The church is down on abortion. The church is down on same-sex marriage. The church is insisting Jesus is the only way. There's a few others there, but that's pretty much enough. And what the church needs to do is shift the way they think. Pretty much what President Clinton just said a couple weeks ago. We need to change the way we think to reach the millennials. So again, I asked the question, exactly what are we evangelizing them to anymore? Well, the reason I brought up Wycliffe is because one of the things that's happened with some publishing in the mission world has been that they're removing references to God the Father and Jesus the Son, because that offends Muslim sensibilities. So you don't talk to Muslims about the Trinity, you don't talk about the deity of Christ, you don't talk about any things that offend Muslim sensibilities. Again, suppose you win them, what exactly are you winning them to?
Right.
Or is it just pure bait and switch? Well, we didn't want to tell you about this, but now you can really know. How honest is that? We're winning them to this generic thing that means nothing. And now it's in the American context, and it's pretty much the way the game's played in this country. Well, I don't see Jesus saying that. I see him saying something different, teaching them to observe all that I have commanded you to. So, at what point do we decide we edit what Jesus teaches? Well, I'm sorry, this is too much for them. Wow. But we've been doing it. We've been doing it a long time. So God now comes out. Well, I think Joel Osteen's the best understanding of this. All right, God is the giant teddy bear. God is Santa Claus. God is a slot machine. God is the force field of Star Wars. He's this pantheistic life force that you see in Avatar or Band of the Things. And talk to young people and see if that's not who God is for them. And my Jesus would never judge anybody. My Jesus would never send my Wiccan friend to hell. My Jesus would never send my Muslim friend to hell, my Buddhist friend to fill in the blank. You get the idea. So the net result for me as a missionary is, why am I wasting my time if this is true? Or was Jesus lying about this, or was he not? And that's the question I have. If all this stuff is true, there's no point to mission. And I told our staff years ago, because we've been, Pastor Keith talked about our support raising. We've been raising support for a long time, as have thousands of other people I've met over the years. And a lot of missions have cut down completely. A lot of missionaries I know have left the field. Why? Can't raise support. Why? It's just really not their thing anymore. It's more about building Six Flags over Jesus in your congregation than it is about sending people out as missionaries. And so a ton of missionaries, if they're going to stay on the field at all, they're basically bivocational. And I told our staff, we probably have to get used to this, that we're not going to be able to raise support because the churches, so many of them have just kind of lost interest. And that's where we're at. Well, Jesus says to make disciples, teach them all things. And then he says this most amazing thing, I am with you always, even to the end of the earth. Maybe one of the best promises in the entire Bible, right? He is with us always. I want you to think about that because it's always quoted in the context of missions. It's the classic verse. He is talking about when you go out as a missionary, he's with you in a special way. And I don't begin to define that. I'm not sure I can. I want to expand that though. He's not talking about just only in the context of missions. He's talking about in the context of martyrs. Do we think Jesus did not know what was going to happen to these guys when he sent them out? 11 of the 12 are going to be killed in the next 35 years. And do you think he didn't know? If you were to flip over to John 21, we don't have the time, but if you were to, he's very explicit when Peter starts getting in Jesus' face about a few things. He tells Peter, guess what's coming for you, Peter?
Right.
This is how you're going to die. He knew exactly where he was sending these guys. He knew what was going to happen to Thomas when Thomas goes to India. He knows the different things that are going to happen to James and everybody else there. He also knows what's going to happen to their disciples and their disciples. It's like that, Amway thing running forever. He knows exactly what's going to happen. And he sends them anyways. Did he do that because he hated them? He gives us this amazing promise, I am with you always. Keith was, when he was talking well this morning in Sunday school, the first part, he was bringing up persecution. I was telling Terry, I said, this fits in so well with what I'm saying because it has been the historic understanding throughout most of the world's history of this despising of Christians. And this hatred leads to death. Why should it be a surprise to us? Jesus says it so plainly. And this is where Dan Kimball was so wrong. If they hate you, it's because they hate me first. That's John 15. So many other places. All right, the hatred of non-Christians. I understand that. That was me. I didn't know any Christians, but I hated them all. Morons. Idiots. People who hate the mind, hate God, hate science. I mean, I knew all this. I didn't actually know a Christian. Didn't have any around. Right? But I was so convinced of what I knew. And of course I found out I knew very little, next to nothing. Well, I think I'm pretty much average now. I think there's a whole lot of people out there with their conceptions of Christianity being shaped by what they see on TV or the internet and media. And that's it. They don't know. When I was in the graduate program at DU, the University of Denver, it's such a little bubble. All my teachers are Marxists and postmoderns. And all of a sudden I'm in their bubble. And they were really frustrated with that. Some of them got very mad. But one of my teachers, he wrote me this little letter. It's the most interesting thing. He said, I hate all things Christian. I only found out later on he was orphaned in early age and grew up in a Catholic orphanage. Starts to make a little more sense to me, this anger he had. He says, I hate all things Christian. And he mentioned particularly what Christians does a guy in that little bubble understand. Jerry Falwell and Pat Robertson. He says, but you're the only person I've ever met that walks the walk. It's not my brilliant personality. He was reacting to the fact that we adopted 2 children from the Philippines while I was in the doctoral program there. Everybody else is avoiding doing anything else. We made this weird move that liberals couldn't begin to understand because they're the ones with kind hearts. Christians are the dogmatic, mean-spirited, fundamentalist jerks that we can't stand from what we see on TV. They just didn't know. They'd never been around Christians. Just like I had never been around Christians. I really do understand them. I don't get angry with them all. It makes perfect sense inside their little bubble. Which is one of the reasons why I think Jesus told the Christians, at least the early community of Christians, to get out of their little bubble and go somewhere else and start sharing. Was the price tag going to be easy? Not one bit. In fact, it was going to be incredibly difficult. And blood is going to be spilled, and it's not pretty. So I think in our attempts here as American Christians to make our faith and to make ourselves more likable, we want people to like us, We have lost our prophetic voice. We can't speak to our culture anymore. We are our culture. We identify as our culture. We act like our culture, dress, watch, entertain ourselves by we are just what our culture is. And if you're just like the culture, how can you say don't? How can you say stop? And so we've lost our voice, and even our young people have pretty much turned against us as well in some respects. Again, certain churches have grown well. But what are we teaching them? How are we teaching them to do all things that Jesus commands us? So I think that when we emphasize the presence of God, when we go out and witness to people, that Jesus called us to do that, that he promised us he would be there. I think it was a full understanding that he wasn't wasting his time. Why? Because he's not a liar. And he sent the Christian church out to do what it's called to do. Not because he wants to waste anybody's time, not because he's interested in watching his people suffer and die. I think he did it because he's got such an amazing plan in motion here. That we are all just a little bit of a fraction of a part of that. And I think one of the joys of going into places where we have gone, and had some of the encounters we've had that sometimes have been rather nasty, got people screaming and yelling at us, all sorts of fun things, is to have people write us every once in a while. It's like God sends us a little reminder. People will write us years later in some cases and say, I just want to tell you guys thanks. Because I come to Christ, or my kid has come to Christ. And we've had enough of those who say, we're not wasting our time when people cuss us out and scream at us. Fine. I like this. Thanks, Lord. Appreciate that one. And we've had some really fun encounters like that over the years. And you get reminded of the fact that God is the one in control of this whole thing. This is all his. And our job is to be faithful. And he may call us to some dark places, but it doesn't mean he's done with you. It doesn't mean he's not happy with you because things are not going well. It may mean exactly the opposite. I think he loved these fellows intensely. And he's about to send them out to a dark place. How did he love them intensely? They've already seen it. He died for them. Greater love has no man. And he went out and did it. They'd seen that. And in light of that, he calls them to go out. And so they did. Took a while for some. Not a fun thing. I'm convinced that Jesus is not a liar. So, in light of that, me and Jesus, we outnumber all the demons there are in this world. Me and Jesus, we outnumber all the Muslims, and the Hindus, and the Buddhists, and the Jains, and the Sikhs, and everybody else there is. Me and Jesus, we outnumber the world, period. And I don't need to fear anything, because he's with me. I fear one, the God who made me, and I fear nothing else. And I think that's his invitation to all of us as we go out, to remember that he is with you. You don't need to be in fear anymore. Let's pray. Father, can we thank you for love and mercy? We don't want to stumble over words, Father. I just hope that your Spirit speaks through this passage that we're asking you. Father, I pray that we would honor you and glorify you, and we would be different, Father, because you love us. You are intensely in the business of changing us. We thank you for this chance to share your word with, Father, in your name.